The morning my son-in-law threw my late wife's toolbox into the trash, I didn't say a word. I just stood there on the back porch, watching him drag that old red Craftsman chest across the gravel like it was nothing more than junk. Like 43 years of my wife Dorothy's hands on those handles meant absolutely nothing. I remember the way the metal scraped against the driveway. I remember thinking, this is the moment. This is where it ends. But let me back up. Because for you to understand what I did next, you need to understand what that toolbox meant, and what kind of man I had become in the 2 years since Dorothy passed. My name is Walter. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Knoxville, Tennessee, and another 8 working part-time at the county library after I retired, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with myself once the classroom was gone. Dorothy and we built a life together that wasn't flashy. We had a 3-bedroom house on Sycamore Ridge Road that we paid off in full by the time we were both 52. We had a savings account that made our financial advisor nervous because we barely touched it. And we had a workshop in the back corner of the garage where Dorothy, who was far more mechanically gifted than I ever was, kept her tools organized with a precision that would have made a surgeon jealous. Dorothy died on a Thursday in March, 22 months before any of this happened. Pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in October and gone by spring. I won't go into the details of those months because honestly, I still can't do it without losing myself entirely. What I will say is that when she died, the house got very quiet, and I got very lost, and for a long time the only thing that made me feel close to her was going into that workshop and touching her tools, running my fingers along the handles, smelling the machine oil, pretending she had just stepped out and would be back any minute. Our son Marcus called me 2 months after Dorothy's funeral. He was 34 at the time, living in Charlotte with his wife Brittany. They had been married for 3 years. I had met Brittany at the wedding and a handful of holidays before that, and I had always been polite with her the way you are. Polite with someone you don't fully trust but are willing to give the benefit of the doubt. She was sharp, I'll say that. Quick with words. Always seemed to be calculating something just behind her eyes. Marcus told me he had lost his job. The tech startup he'd been working for had folded, and he and Brittany were upside down on their apartment lease in Charlotte and had some credit card debt they were trying to manage. He asked if they could come stay with me in Knoxville for a while, just until they got back on their feet. Maybe 6 months, he said. He was already looking at job opportunities in the area. Brittany had some remote work she was doing. They would help around the house, he promised. It would actually be good for me, he said. Not to be alone. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. Dorothy would have said yes without even thinking about it. They arrived on a Saturday with 2 cars packed full of boxes and a confidence that I didn't quite understand at the time. Brittany walked through the front door, and I watched her eyes move across every room with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. She complimented the kitchen. She said the living room was cozy. She said the backyard was bigger than she remembered. Little comments. Casual. But I noticed. The first month was fine. Marcus was applying for jobs. Brittany was on her laptop most of the day. They cooked dinner twice a week and kept their part of the house reasonably clean. I stayed out of their way. I went to the library 3 mornings a week. I visited Dorothy's grave on Sundays. I tried to be grateful for the company. The second month, things shifted. Not dramatically at first. Small things. Brittany started rearranging items in the kitchen without asking. The coffee mugs Dorothy had collected from every state we'd ever visited, little ceramic souvenirs lined up on the shelf above the sink, got moved to a box in the pantry. When I asked about it, Brittany said she was just trying to organize things, that the shelf looked cluttered. I moved the mugs back. She moved them again 3 days later. Marcus, when I brought it up, told me Brittany just had strong opinions about space. He said it with a little laugh, like it was endearing. I let it go. By the 3rd month, Brittany had developed opinions about everything. The furniture arrangement in the living room was inefficient. The guest bathroom needed to be repainted. The backyard landscaping was overgrown. She started referring to rooms as our bedroom and our bathroom in a way that bothered me, but that I couldn't quite articulate why. It was their bedroom. They were using it. I understood that, but there was something in the possessiveness of the phrasing that felt like something else. 6 months came and went. Marcus had gotten some freelance consulting work, but nothing permanent. Brittany's remote job had apparently dried up, though she never fully explained the details. They were still looking, Marcus said. Still trying to figure out the right move. Just a couple more months, Dad, he said. I promise. I gave them the couple more months. And then another couple. And then we were at the 1-year mark, and Marcus and Brittany were still in my house on Sycamore Ridge Road, still not paying rent, still not paying utilities, still eating food I bought, and the conversations about their departure had become so vague and so infrequent that I had started to wonder if the 6-month plan had ever been real in the first place. It was around this time that Brittany started talking about the house itself. It started as suggestions. Maybe I should think about downsizing someday. A house this size was a lot for one person to maintain. Property taxes on a place like this had to be significant. Had I thought about what I was going to do with it long term? There were some really lovely senior living communities in the area with lots of amenities. I told her I was 63 years old and in excellent health and had no interest in senior living. She smiled and said, of course. She was just thinking ahead. For my benefit, then the suggestions became more specific. If I ever did decide to sell, they would be interested in buying the house from me. They could give me a fair price. It would keep the house in the family. Dorothy would have wanted the family to stay connected to the home, wouldn't she? That last part invoking Dorothy. I should have said something then. I should have drawn the line clearly and firmly right at that moment. But I didn't. I just said I'd think about it and change the subject, and I saw the look that passed between Marcus and Brittany when they thought I wasn't watching, and I put that look in a drawer in the back of my mind and tried to forget it. I didn't forget it. The toolbox moment happened on a Tuesday in October, about 14 months after they had moved in. I had been out at the library all morning. When I came home, I noticed that the garage workshop looked different. The door was open, which I always kept closed. I walked over and felt my stomach drop. Things had been moved. Several of Dorothy's larger power tools the table saw she had saved up for, the bandsaw her father had given her, were pushed against the far wall, covered with drop cloths. The workbench had been partially cleared, and Brittany's car, which normally sat in the driveway, was now parked in the garage in the space where Dorothy had always worked. I found the red Craftsman toolbox at the edge of the trash cans. I stood there for a long moment. I picked it up. I brought it inside. I set it on the kitchen table. And then I sat down and I looked at it for probably 15 minutes while my heart did something complicated in my chest. Brittany came in from the backyard. She saw the toolbox on the table. She said, "Oh, she hadn't realized I wanted that. She thought it was old stuff." She said she was just trying to make the garage more functional since Marcus was going to be using it for a workspace. I asked her if she had gone through Dorothy's tools without asking me. She said she was just trying to help. She said the garage had become kind of a museum and maybe it was time to start letting some things go. I want to be clear about what happened next because I think it matters. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse. I said very quietly that Dorothy's workshop was not to be touched without my permission. That those tools belonged to her, that this was my home, and nothing in it was to be moved or thrown away without my knowledge. Brittany looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Patient, practiced, like she had prepared for this moment. And she said, "Walter, I understand this is emotional for you, but Marcus and I have been here for over a year. We've been putting our lives on hold. We've been helping you. At some point, this house has to work for the people living in it, not just as a shrine to someone who is gone." The word shrine hit me somewhere behind the sternum. I said I would like her to leave the kitchen. She left. I sat there with Dorothy's toolbox, and I made a decision. The next morning, I called my attorney. Her name is Patricia, and I've worked with her since Dorothy and I bought the house 20 years ago. She specializes in estate planning and property law, and she has an office about 20 minutes from my house. I told her I needed to come in. I told her I needed to understand my options clearly. I did not want to make any mistakes. Patricia met with me for 2 hours. I laid out the entire situation, how long Marcus and Brittany had been staying, what had been said, the direction I could see things heading. She was direct, which is why I like her. She told me that because Marcus and Brittany had no formal tenancy agreement and had never paid rent, they were considered guests, not tenants, under Tennessee law. That distinction was important. It meant the process of asking them to leave was simpler than if they had established tenancy. She also told me something I already knew but needed to hear from a professional. My house was mine. My savings were mine. My property was mine. Dorothy and I had spent decades building what we had, and not a single dollar of it carried any obligation to Marcus and Brittany beyond what I chose to give. I asked Patricia about my will. Dorothy and I had updated it 2 years before she passed. Marcus was listed as the primary beneficiary for the house and the majority of the estate. I told Patricia I wanted to revisit that. She pulled up the documents, and we talked for a long time. I want to be honest here, because I know some people will say what I did was harsh. I changed my will. I didn't remove Marcus entirely. He is my son, and I love him. But I restructured things significantly. A substantial portion of the estate that had been designated for the house and its contents I redirected. Some of it to a scholarship fund in Dorothy's name at the local community college, where she had taken welding classes in her 50s just because she wanted to learn. Some of it to the Knoxville Animal Shelter, where we had adopted our old dog Biscuit back in 2009. I also added a specific provision protecting Dorothy's tools as a designated collection if Marcus ever did inherit anything. Those tools were to be donated to the vocational program at the high school where I had taught, so that students learning carpentry and metalwork could use them. Dorothy would have loved that. I didn't tell anyone what I had done. I drove home. I made dinner. I was quiet at the table, which was not unusual. Marcus asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. I asked him how the job search was going. He said he had a promising lead. I nodded. Brittany asked if I had thought any more about what she had mentioned about the long-term plan for the house. I said I had been giving it some thought. Yes. She looked encouraged. I let her look encouraged. Over the next 2 weeks, I handled things methodically. I went through every important document in the house insurance policies, the deed, financial account information, tax records, and I moved them to a fireproof lockbox that I kept in my car. I opened a separate checking account at a different bank and arranged for my pension and Social Security deposits to route there. Not because I thought Marcus would do anything dramatic, but because I had learned over the past 14 months that clarity was its own protection. I also called my daughter. I should have mentioned before Marcus has an older sister, my daughter Renee. She lives in Nashville. She and Marcus have always been close, but Renee has a steadiness to her that Marcus sometimes lacks. Renee and I talk every Sunday. I told her everything, not to create conflict, but because she deserved to know, and because I needed someone in my corner who understood the whole picture. Renee was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then she said, "Dad, what do you need from me?" I said, "Just know what's happening." She said, "I know. I've been watching this." That meant more to me than I can say. The conversation I had with Marcus happened on a Sunday morning. Brittany had gone to run errands. I told Marcus I needed to talk with him, just the two of us. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with Dorothy's toolbox, and I said what I needed to say. I told him I loved him. I told him I had been glad to help when he called, because that is what parents do, and what I would always do. I told him I had given the situation real time and real patience, and that I was proud of some of the ways he had worked to get back on his feet. And then I told him clearly, this arrangement needed to end. I said I was asking them to leave by the end of November, 6 weeks away. I said I would help, however I reasonably could. I would give him a month's worth of living expenses to cover the transition. I had already identified some reasonably priced apartments in the area if he wanted those listings. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought things were going well. He said he hadn't realized I felt this way. He asked if this was because of Brittany and the garage. I said the garage was part of it, but I told him it was larger than that. I told him that at 64 years old, in my own home, I had started feeling like a guest in my own life, and I told him that was not acceptable. Not because I blamed him entirely, but because it was true. He looked at the table. He said he was sorry about the toolbox. He said Brittany hadn't realized what it meant. I said she had known exactly what it meant. And I said it without anger, just as a statement of fact, because I believed it was true. Marcus didn't argue with me. That evening, when Brittany came home, she and Marcus talked privately for a long time. I could hear the low rise and fall of voices from the bedroom. Later that night, Brittany knocked on the door of my study and asked if we could talk. She sat down across from me and she used a tone I had not heard from her before. Reasonable, calm, almost conciliatory. She said she understood I needed my space. She said she respected that this was my home. She said they were absolutely willing to start making concrete plans to leave. And then, carefully, she said, "But while we're figuring things out, had I given any more thought to the idea of helping them get started somewhere?" She wasn't asking for the house, she said quickly. She just meant, was there anything in the estate plan, any resources, anything I might be willing to put toward helping them establish themselves? It would be an investment in Marcus's future. Dorothy would have wanted Marcus to be secure. There it was again, Dorothy. I looked at Brittany for a moment, and I thought about Patricia's office, and the revised documents sitting in a folder, and Dorothy's tools eventually going to students who would actually use them. I told Brittany that I had indeed recently reviewed my estate planning and made some updates, and that I was comfortable with where things stood. She waited for me to say more. I didn't. Her expression shifted just slightly. A recalibration. She thanked me for the conversation and left. I think that was the moment she understood that the window she had been calculating had quietly closed. They left on the 14th of November, 2 weeks before my deadline. I helped Marcus load the truck. I carried boxes. I did not make it awkward. I hugged him at the end and told him I meant what I said. I would always help him when I could, and I needed him to know the difference between help and surrender. He looked like he was going to say something for a moment. Then he just nodded. Brittany said goodbye from the passenger window of the moving truck. I waved. That was the extent of it. The first night alone in the house, I made the dinner Dorothy used to make every November, a simple roast chicken with sweet potatoes and green beans, the kind of meal that makes a house smell like a home. I set the table for one. I put Dorothy's ceramic state mugs back on the shelf above the sink, all 51 of them, in the order we had collected them. I went out to the garage workshop after dinner. I uncovered Dorothy's table saw. I cleaned the bandsaw. I reorganized the toolbox back to the way she kept it sorted by type, handles facing out, the way she had shown me years ago when she had tried patiently to teach me to love working with my hands the way she did. I stood in that workshop for a long time, and for the first time in 14 months, it felt like hers again. Marcus and I have talked 3 times since he left. The conversations are careful, the way conversations are when something has shifted, and both people know it, and neither one is quite ready to say so, but they are honest, and they are getting easier. Renee came to visit for Thanksgiving, and we cooked together and talked about Dorothy and laughed at old stories, and it felt like the house was breathing again. I am 64 years old. I have a house that is paid for, and a savings account, and a workshop full of my late wife's tools, and a scholarship fund that will send someone to welding class every year in her name. I have a daughter who answers my calls and a cat I adopted in September named Roosevelt who has claimed Dorothy's reading chair as his own personal property. I have a life that is mine. There is a version of this story where I let it keep going, where I told myself it was fine, that family is complicated, that I should be grateful for the company, that the workshop was just a room, and the toolbox was just metal, and the mugs were just mugs, and Dorothy was gone anyway, and none of it mattered. I am glad I didn't tell myself that story, because the truth is, the things that carry someone you love, the objects they touched and chose and cared for, those things matter. The space they built their life in matters. And when someone looks you in the eye and calls that space a shrine, like honoring the dead is a malfunction, like grief is an inconvenience, standing between them and what they want, that is not a misunderstanding. That is a choice they are making about what you are worth. I know what I am worth. Dorothy knew it too. She told me often enough. If you're watching this and you're in a situation where someone is slowly making you feel like a stranger in your own home, in your own life, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to act. You are allowed to draw the line. You are allowed to love your family and still say no. Those two things are not in conflict. The dock my father-in-law built is still standing in a photograph on my wall. Dorothy is in that photograph, 19 years old, laughing at something off camera. Every morning when I walk past it, I say good morning to her. Roosevelt usually meows from the chair at roughly the same time, which I choose to take as a sign. The house is quiet again, but it is not empty, not even close. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've been through something similar, I would genuinely like to hear from you in the comments. You are not alone, and you are not wrong for protecting what is yours. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. There are more than you might think. And I'll see you in the next one.